coming up next?
We've got some very interesting discussions, historical and comfortable truths and blind spots, decolonization of African media.
Oh, that's right. Have you ever looked at a story in the newspaper or on TV, particularly on international media, on Africa and thought, what? Have you ever looked at those images and felt, this doesn't represent me? Do you ever feel like they're pushing a narrative that is not reflective of your own reality? Well, the question that Ben is going to be asking is, whose responsibility is it to correct that?
Right. And what do we do about that? And it should be very interesting. You know how, for the longest time in Africa, the picture you get in the Western media is a child with a fly, buzzing around their face. What do we do to change that narrative? What do we do to challenge that narrative? What do we do to make sure we have new narratives for that? That's the question we're asking today.
Yeah, and he's got an incredible panel to help him discuss that, so I will leave the stage so that you can do so.
Thank you very much. As you just heard from Edith, we have a really powerful expert panel who have been carefully chosen to make sure that we're able to have discussions about this in terms of what we do to deeply reflect on some of these truths, some very uncomfortable truths about Africa and what we can do to challenge them, and also chart new narratives for the African continent, especially in terms of how we tell our stories here in the media. And so we've got some very, very special panelists who are with us. Two with us in the room, one is joining us online. Our first panelist is someone that we will all be very familiar with. He's a young global leader from the World Economic Forum. He's been twice named among the most influential Africans by New Africa magazine. He's an international correspondent with the CNN. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to EASTFest 2022, Larry Madowo. He's also got a small country following him on Twitter, so I've got to make sure I take a picture with him and have him tag me so I can get some Twitter followers today before I have to go look for that $8. Welcome, Larry. Good to see you. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be back in Kampala. How's everybody doing? The two people I paid responded. Everybody else is ignoring me. But I'm not salty.
A lot of people don't know this, but Kampala is a bit special to you. You're not really a foreigner here, are you?
No, I'm here all the time. This is actually, I think, my third time here this year.
Yeah.
So it's great to be back.
Great to have you. Our next panelist is a friend of mine. I've worked with him for a very long time. He's also a down, outright, simply awesome human being. I've never seen him angry. Apparently, I think something in whatever water he drinks. He currently leads the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. Please welcome to EASTFest 2022, Mr. Solomon Serwanja.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Welcome. It's nice to have you with us. How have things been for you?
Well, good. Still at 4 babies. I've not gotten a 5th one. But I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to always be back home at the Media Channel.
He's been traveling. He was in Belgium. He was in the US. He's all over the place. I'm living vicariously through his timeline.
Listen, who is talking about traveling? He has dinner in New York. He's in Kampala. Tomorrow you'll hear that he's in Namibia. How do you even do that?
It is what we call goals. Goals, right. Our third panelist will be very familiar to the dinosaurs in the room, as we like to call them. For most of us growing up back in the 90s, Moky Makura was just that fest that you looked forward to. I think every Sunday evening it was at the time. Solomon will be very familiar with this. I'm sure it probably inspired you to become a journalist at the time. We remember her for Africa's award-winning show, Carte Blanche, and she is a typical truly international citizen, born in Nigeria, educated in England, has lived in London, in Lagos, and in Johannesburg as well. She's a producer, an author, a TV presenter, a publisher, an entrepreneur. She's done literally everything there is to do. She's currently executive director of Africa No Filter, which is a donor collaborative focused on shifting the African narrative. Please welcome to EASTFest 2022, Moky Makura. Moky, it's so good to see you. I think you might be muted. We're trying to make sure we can hear you. If you could make sure that your mic is on.
me.
Okay, we can
Okay,
hear you
great.
now.
Sorry.
Right.
I was saying, you said the dinosaurs in the room would remember me. I'm so upset. But anyway, hi, everybody. Great to see you. And I'm absolutely gutted I am not sitting there in person.
No, absolutely. When I talked about that, I wasn't referring to you. I mean, you look.
No,
like
the
you're
people
He was
who
referring
would
to us,
remember me.
Moky.
Yeah.
He was referring to us.
Right. So we've got a really and we're trying to think about some of the things that are very important to talk about. Larry, I'm going to start with you. You've been at the center of a lot of things going on, especially to do with telling stories from the African context, in terms of what's going on as an African journalist working for a foreign legacy platform like the CNN, in terms of how we create change. I know we've had a discussion about this before we came here in terms of what that looks like. Let me start by picking up on something that's been happening in the recent past, where you almost became persona non grata in some parts of the world for sharing some, again, as we're talking about this morning, uncomfortable truths. You put out a tweet where you basically suggested that not everyone was mourning when the Queen died. What was the response to that like for you, and how did it make you feel, especially again from the context of what we're talking about for the African narrative?
All right, so for some context, the Queen died recently, the Queen of England. There's many queens in this part of the world, legitimate ones too. And at the time, I think there was a whole global outpouring of grief that was expected, performative mourning, because of who the Queen was. She was on the throne for 70 years, which is incredible. You got to give that to her. And I did what we call a live hate, so a reaction from the African continent of how the continent is mourning the Queen. And I pointed out that I'm from Kenya, so in 1952, when Queen Elizabeth became queen, she was on holiday in Kenya. And she was a princess at the time, and they say that she'd gone up somewhere in Nyeri, close to Mount Kenya. She went up the treetops to, enjoy the views, and that's when her dad died. So when they say a young girl went up the treetops, a princess, and came down a queen. And around the same time, the Mau Mau rebellion was just beginning to grow in Kenya. So if you don't remember your history, the Mau Mau rebellion was a group of native Kenyans, and I use native in big air quotes, who were waging a guerrilla war against the colonialists because they believed that we deserved independence as a country. And so what then happened is the British colonial administration in Kenya herded about 1.5 million people in what were essentially concentration camps, where they were tortured. Unspeakable things happened to them. And in that time, some of them were killed and stuff like that. And so I gave that history that, listen, even though the airbrushed history is that a young girl came to Kenya, a princess, and left a queen, there's an uncomfortable history here with so much subjugation and torture and murder and rape. And that too is part of her legacy. And so I did this one, a couple of hits. I posted it on my Twitter and got on a flight, and it flew a long way all the way to Canada. And I got off the plane. I'm like, wow, this got 1.7 million views, because there's a lot of people who have a lot of thoughts about this, and not all of them are positive. But I think, long story short, the reason why maybe this got a lot of attention is because at the time, if I worked at the BBC, I don't think maybe I would have been allowed to do that for obvious reasons. The reason why this looked odd is because I am an African who was born and raised in Africa. So my perspective that I bring to the coverage of the continent is slightly different from somebody who's sent here from anywhere in North America or Europe. And I can't escape that. It is just who I am. What I represent is my own lived reality as an African who's born and raised here. That's the perspective I bring to every story I do, whether it's coverage of the Queen's death, or it is something mundane as Elon Musk firing almost everyone that works in the Twitter Africa office in Ghana. And while everybody in North America and Europe gets severance pay and next steps, the people in Africa don't get that. That's just the reality of what it is. So I'm not giving any views, I'm just telling the truth. But those truths happen to be uncomfortable for people who are used to a certain way of storytelling from the continent told by outsiders.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. So, Moky, let me come to you just to get some insight on this as well, because you've been at the heart of telling some of these stories. You've also been doing lots of studies in terms of what the narrative is like in Africa. And Larry just pointed out the fact that he wasn't trying to share an opinion. He was simply pointing out some facts that should be there for everyone to see. And yet, the way these get presented to the world sometimes seems to be biased from an African perspective. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Larry's exactly spot on. There is a frame or a lens through which often the world writes about Africa. Journalists in the global north tend to write about Africa. And when we started Africa No Filter, and by the way, Africa No Filter works on narrative change. And we understand that narratives evolve through stories told persistently over time. So if you want to change narratives, you've got to change the underlying stories. But what we did was to figure out what are these underlying stories. And we found that there are 5 key frames or lenses through which most stories about Africa in the media are told. And those are poverty, poor leadership, corruption, conflict, and disease. And those frames are leading to narratives like Africa is broken, Africa is dependent, and Africans really lack the agency to make the change. And we've actually gone further and looked at how, for example, Africa shows up in the US media. This was a report we did about 2 years ago. And actually, most of the content that Americans see about Africa is linked to politics. And you know that our politicians are not always doing the best for us. And also crime. I mean, I'm sure some of you would have seen, you know, the Nigerian fraudster who went down, Instagram, influencer. Those are the kind of stories. So if you imagine that you are bombarded with stories that show this negative, sort of stereotypical image all the time, it actually informs your beliefs and informs your perceptions about Africa and Africans, and ultimately informs your actions. This is why, aid policies into Africa, trade policies into Africa, investment into Africa are impacted by these narratives. And this is why we work on them. But the last thing I will say is, Larry, it's amazing that you are working for one of the leading global media outlets. But what we're finding is that there isn't a lot of African representation at decision-making levels. If you think about the BBC, over 300, well, at the time, because I think that's changing now, 300 plus journalists they hired, probably the organization that hired the most journalists in Africa. They were not necessarily in editorial decision-making spaces where it mattered. So regardless, what we know is that we are not writing our own stories. Regardless of who the reporter is on the ground, the editors ultimately are making the decision on the framing and the actual story that gets put out.
Okay, and I think, Larry, you'll probably want to speak into this a little bit after I come to Solomon, because especially on the issue of decision-making, right? So where you are at this end now, you might not be that high up the food chain, but you do have the ability to maybe speak into what happens and how it's done. So maybe you want to, speak into that a bit. But let me start with Solomon. Moky talked about the things that are usually prevalent in terms of when you talk about Africa from a storytelling perspective: disease, poverty, corruption, leadership. One of the challenges that comes is that, especially with our media here in Africa, a lot of our reporting tends to be, well, negative, right? And there's always this thing about, why aren't we telling more positive stories? Why aren't we telling more good news? Is it possible that maybe our problems are that many that you can't ignore them?
Ben, thanks for having me. First of all, let me just say how I am honored to sit next to Larry, who I admire because of his, speaking truth to power. He comes out and says it as it is, unapologetic. He says very strong, views that, are facts, but facts that we don't want to talk about it. And let me get to your answer. I think I agree with what Moky was saying. The dominant frames that come through our stories certainly shape the agenda and the discussion. The stories that we put out there reflect who we are. And I wanted to give you a classic example of this, and maybe it's timely. What's happening in Egypt at the COP27. So, as you know, Uganda is exploring its East African crude oil pipeline going through Tanzania. There's been a heavy pushback from the West against the project. And the way the story is being told, like Uganda is the devil, We are going Europe is setting standards. You guys are exploring oil. You're going to be adding 6.5 billion barrels of crude oil into the global market. You're the devil. You have to stop. You have to stop. You have to stop.
Killing the planet.
We're killing the planet. But what actually we have seen in the recent past, because of the Ukraine-Russia war, Germany is reopening its coal plants. Europe is getting scared of how it's going to go through winter. And they're going back to all these factories, and they're saying we don't have a lot of options. We have to reopen. I think Germany has reopened about 8. We have, I think Sweden is also rethinking that. Look, London drives its central line and train system on coal, right? So then we begin to think, okay, should we start writing why is the West, reopening its terrible heavy carbon emissions to drive their economy and to help them survive through the winter and to go through this. However, what we're seeing is the way the Western media is put the dominant frames in the stories of Western media is, surviving the Russia war. So they're sort of moving away from, hey, we are reopening coal plants, we're going to be increasing our carbon footprints, we're going to be putting it out. Like, it's not like, okay, how do we go past the Russia, this Putin who is doing all this and surviving the winter, right? And then from the West again, a movement pushing back on ECOP. Africa only contributes 2% of carbon emissions. 2. Uganda in itself contributes about 0.1%, right? The dominant frames that we hear is stop ECOP. You're going to be heavily emitted. Not to say that, Uganda, for example, has been heavily investing in hydropower, right? We're having the economy is powered by hydropower. We have dams. We're starting to invest heavily into solar energy and all that. No one has been talking about that. But the dominant frames right now that the West is putting is the stop ECOP. And they're sending journalists from, the West to come and explore how Uganda is the devil and how it's going to be actually putting 6.5 billion barrels into the global market. So the dominant frames that are put in our stories are very important. And the way we portray our story is important about the way how the world perceives us. And so having people like Larry on the global, and that's what, like I was saying, having people like Larry start to give an alternative view to the common view is important. And this is why it's important for African journalists to tell the African story, because they understand it. I think many of the international media used to bring in reporters from, flying someone from London to come and do a story. Really, who does that in this day and age? There are, celebrated African journalists who are able to tell the African story using the dominant frames that they think need to be out to the world.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I'm a huge fan of both Moky and Solomon for the work they're doing with the African Institute of Investigative Journalism and Moky and Africa No Filter. And I'm glad, and we've had Moky on CNN to talk about the work that she's doing that's important, which is critical of the global media, including CNN. And I think one other thing that I need to point out, to the BBC's credit, when they hired more than 300 journalists because of the Africa 2020 program, which is sadly now getting wound down, is they were not just journalists on the continent, in Lagos and in Dakar and in Joburg and mostly Nairobi. There were also African journalists in those editorial decision-making positions, because I was one of them. I didn't have anybody from London telling me this is what you can cover and this is what you can't cover. And I remember, for instance, one time the British Council pitched me a story and I said, yeah, actually I don't like that, so we will not be covering it. And I can't imagine that happening at some state broadcasters that also have operations on the continent, and I'm pointing out specifically the Chinese and Russians here. Those organizations would not allow you to do that. So let's keep it 100 on that. So,
Larry,
yes?
Can I just ask a question before you carry on?
Sure.
Because, the BBC World Service, your content, the stuff that these African journalists worked on, was shown outside of the UK. So the editorial decision-making on what UK people saw was not held by Africans. And that's the point I'm making.
True, the bulk of that content was for international audiences outside of the UK because the BBC News Channel and BBC UK facing content has their own editors, but a lot of the content we made based on our own perspectives and our dominant narratives did end up also airing on the UK channel on BBC Radio 4. I can't tell you how many times I had my own people on my team going on the News at 10 or Today program in the UK to talk about this is an important thing that's happening with the African Continental Free Trade Area, for instance. This is the biggest trade agreement signed since since one major international trade agreement. So I was actively advocating for the stories that went beyond those narratives that you were talking about, conflicts and corruption and poor leadership. Yes, across the board, there's still a dearth. There's not enough Africans in those editorial decision-making positions in the global media, even over stories that directly cover Africa. That's not in doubt, and we need to do better. These organizations need to do better to do that. So yes, that's something I wanted to bring out. And one other thing is, the reason why I do this, the reason why I cover Africa for CNN was a choice, because my last job before doing this, I used to be a North America correspondent for the BBC. I was living pretty in Washington, DC, covering North America. But as an African, I felt that I sold my soul, because I was very critical of the way Africa was covered. I've got an interview out in the Inside CNN newsletter today that talks about, I remember seeing a story in one major American newspaper about fashion in Nairobi that didn't interview a single black Kenyan. Why is that acceptable? Another major global news outlet, a television outlet this time, did a story in Sierra Leone that didn't interview a single black Sierra Leonean. How is that acceptable? These are stories that you come to a place and center outsiders, center foreigners. And the reason why I decided to leave that job covering North America for the BBC is because I felt strongly about making sure that I was covering the African stories that I feel strongly about, and making sure that we were not caricatured in the global press.
Yeah.
Because the BBC had 13 correspondents covering North America. So there was no shortage of people covering North America. But there's still a shortage of people who will cover Africa for the global press with nuance, with a 3D view, so that we are not those people who are constantly fighting each other over land, over politics, over disease and stuff like that.
And those issues still remain critical because they seem to be hindering us as a continent, and I'll ask Solomon to speak into that in terms of some of the work that they've been doing. But to follow up on what Moky said earlier to you, again, in terms of the number of Africans that will be involved in editorial decisions and policy decisions. You have been quite active in your time at the CNN to make sure that you have your stories being told. Maybe you want to speak a bit into that in terms of actually being able to influence the stories that are being told and how they're being told?
Absolutely. I think, and maybe this is the difference between how other organizations work, which is I'm actively deciding that these are the stories I want to tell. These are the stories that CNN should be telling, not just for international audiences, by the way, but also for CNN domestic, because I know that American media especially misunderstands Africa. That's not, again, in doubt. I don't think anybody would disagree. And this then does inform policy, does inform trade agreements. We had seen in some cases as those people that need charity and aid and not trade. So I'm actively pushing for stories that go beyond the usual conflict and disease and politics and corruption, to see Africans in a three-dimensional view. I know I keep saying this because I felt that we were caricatured as Africans, and this misunderstanding of Africans has gone on for so long that I single-handedly can't change it, and Solomon and Edith and Nancy and everybody. But also we have to admit that there's some progress that's been made. These roles were not made for people like us, with our backgrounds. These jobs were not made for Nancy Kachingira and Edith Kimani and Larry Madowo to occupy, but we're here kicking these doors and trying to make sure that our people have a seat at the table and our people are seen as fully three-dimensional human beings. It's a work in progress, but it's work that is necessary, and I will do until my last breath.
Right. Thank you very much. So let me bring in Solomon, and we'll come to you, Moky. Moky, you wanted to say something? You seem to have, yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to just say, I think Larry makes a really good point, and the fact that we have a handful of journalists on an international platform. But actually, we have found that a lot of the problems, or a lot of the way that we are seen, is also in African media. We did a report called How African Media Covers Africa. And we found that at least 81% of the stories that a Ugandan, for example, is reading about Ghana or about Nigeria is exactly the same as what American is reading about any country. The point is 81% of the stories were negative. They were about, political elections, the conflict around them. So and the reason we know is because a lot of African media outlets do not have correspondents in the rest of the continent. So they are dependent on AFP, BBC, Reuters, and those institutions were covering Africa to a certain extent in a particular way. So what the African readers are reading about each other is equally as bad. And you know what? There's an African proverb that says, when you point a finger, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So I actually want to be clear that we shouldn't just be looking and blaming global media. We actually need to look at our own media and how we write about ourselves and about other Africans.
Just say something what Moky is saying. Does that therefore require us to go and redefine what news is? Because quite honestly, many of us have been in newsrooms. Every day we have morning meetings where you come up with story ideas, right? You'll put up many of the stories. What makes it a top story? If there's a riot,
right?
How will a success story compete with a riot story? And therefore, should Africa go back to as we try to change Africa's narrative through we, the storytellers, should we go back to redefine what makes news? That news can actually be positive and make it on the front page, and not just a small sneak peek within the newspaper page 23.
Yeah, so I wanted the 3 of you to talk about this for a bit, because when you're going to tell a story, you're going to be looking for what the big story is. Isn't it fair to say that at the moment, the biggest stories in Africa about Africa, unfortunately, will hinge towards bad leadership and corruption and all these things that we're talking about? And if you're not telling those stories and trying to hold people accountable, aren't you doing a disservice by simply trying to do, puff pieces about how someone saved a dog somewhere in Kampala because you want to be positive?
All right, so I spent a decade working in an African media house, African media houses. So in defense of African media houses, I started my career at KTN in Kenya. I went on to work for NTV in Kenya as well. Popped up on NTV Uganda a couple of times. So here's the thing. Every time I do a story in a country now, I hear people saying, why didn't the local media, why didn't the local journalists do this? But what they don't realize is that I showed up in Nigeria or in Ghana or in Rwanda, and I had a team of 5-6 people. I had a couple of $1,000s to spend to do this one story. And the local outlets can't afford that. Even if they wanted to, they just don't make enough on advertising to be able to cover it to the same extent. So some of that criticism doesn't understand the way the economics of journalism works. It's expensive to make good journalism. And unfortunately, the current funding model for our reporting just does not support it. That is why the African media will unfortunately depend on Reuters and AFP and CNN and the BBC to cover some of these important stories, because they just don't have the protections, they don't have the budgets, they don't have the same deep pockets that we can to make sure that our people are safe in some dangerous places, because they have security consultants with them on the ground that they can stay there for a couple of weeks. So part of it is the reality. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality of the way the economics of our business works, which is, especially for television, it's so expensive, and without video, we really don't have a story. So that's part of the problem. It's not an excuse, but it's just what it is.
Yeah, just to top up on that, I've had an opportunity of working with the big giants. I've had a project which was really funded by the BBC, the taxpayers.
Fantastic work. Everybody should watch it. What was it called? Yeah. Give it a shout out right now.
It was Stealing from the Sick.
Stealing from the Sick.
You guys have watched it, right?
Yeah.
But that project in itself was funded by the BBC Africa Eye project, which is part of the Africa 2020 project. And Larry just whispered in my ears that the project is being concluded, which really scares me, that a lot of funding that has been going into supporting African investigative journalists to tell those stories maybe rechanneled or may be significantly reduced as the project comes to an end. I mean, we had Africa Investigates by Al Jazeera that was also equally funded by, the Qatarians to really support investigative journalism on the continent. For me, what really is very important for us is, in what Larry was saying, that how come people out of Africa are finding funding and in a way have a say to what stories come out of Africa. You know what I mean? So, we all know that he who pays the piper calls the tunes, whether directly or indirectly. Someone cannot spend $50,000 on you to do a story and doesn't have power over what dominant frames should come out strongly. So until when we get to a space where we appreciate journalism and indeed investigative journalism as a continent to look for funding, the taxpayers in the UK pay for the BBC Africa Eye project. Why don't we have a special kind of funding from within the continent, raise resources from within? We have millionaires and billionaires on the continent who have made it. How can we make them have a mindset shift in the power of journalism and indeed investigative journalism so that they can fund? So I think what Larry is trying to say is, what alternative funding models can we adapt as a continent to support our journalism to tell the African story?
Right, and we've been having some I'll come to you, Moky, in just a moment. We've been having discussions even here at EASTFest about media viability and how to be able to find alternative revenue streams, and we had some discussions about that yesterday. And it's a bit obvious that it's a big challenge and one that needs to be addressed. How that gets addressed is a whole different story. So I don't know what we do about that. Moky?
Well, I was just going to say, first of all, Africa No Filter is a funder of media. And I'm going to come back to that. But what I do want to sort of just clarify, that I'm not saying that we shouldn't do difficult stories or negative news. That is equally a part of Africa's story. When there is conflict, the coups in West Africa, Ebola, when our leaders do, those are stories that we need to do. So that role of media to hold our leaders to account, or to, speak truth to power, or to go out and tell those difficult stories, that needs to continue. But that is not all that we are. And that's the point I'm making. It goes to that point of Chimamanda's, single story. We are not that single story. And you refer to this puff piece. And I think the point is that we need to redefine news. News, when somebody does well, or when, like this innovator does something amazing, it's equally news. And I think we are struggling to let news editors who come out of the old school understand that, if it bleeds, it leads. It's not a definition of news. The news is a reflection of what is happening that's new in that country. And that's what we're trying to drive to. And the reason why I'm stressing this, and I know this, is that Africa No Filter has funded an organization called BIRD, which is a news agency. We did it in direct response to that research we did, where we knew that African media outlets did not have the resources to go out and cover stories in the rest of Africa. So we said, fine, use Reuters for those negative stories and the conflict stories and the big stories, which are news. But where will you get your puff news, as you call it, from? We call it stories. It's still news. And we created BIRD. Right now, we have 70 media partners, including the Nation Media and lots. Quartz Africa, they take the content. But what we're doing is we're struggling to find journalists, media outlets that take this content every day. For every bad news story, there should be a good news story, because we are more than just bad news. And I think that's the point that I want to make. And my final point is, there is an organization in Kenya called Odipadev that did some research about what stories people wanted. And they looked at 16 media outlets in Kenya and the content that they were putting on Facebook and Instagram. And they measured how much engagement the stories got. Do you know, they found that in the top 50 stories, the most engaged with content was not the political stories. It was not the conflict stories. It wasn't the big exposés. It was the human interest stories. It was the soft stories. One of the big stories was when this Kenyan teacher won Teacher of the Year. This is what people want to read. And I think to a certain extent, there's a disconnect between news outlets, their definition of what news is, and what people want. News fatigue is a real thing. The coverage, the relentless coverage of COVID, the relentless coverage of the US elections. People are tired of persistent, constant negative news. And that's what we're saying. We need a balance. It's not either or, it's both.
Redefining news. Can I just say something? I tweeted, the BBC put out a tweet for some of us who follow it on Twitter and on Instagram, that a cat was returned to its owner after 6 years. And it's a big story in the UK. And they said, what a miracle. And I'm thinking, is that news? and so for me, I think what Moky is trying to say, can we redefine what news is in our newsrooms?
So,
I thought I said that. I wasn't trying to say it. I was saying it.
It is.
I want to know all the cat rescue news.
I know,
honestly.
right? So let's talk about that for a moment. What stories are not being told about Africa that we should be hearing a little bit more about? Larry, we'll start with you, because you're traversing the continent on a weekly basis. What are some of the stories that you've been seeing that you think we should be having a lot more of this going on in terms of what the media is saying about us?
Let me flip that question, which is, I completely understand, and I feel like I didn't come on this panel to defend foreign reporting on Africa. I feel like that's what I've been doing for half an hour. That was not my intention. That said, there's so many fascinating, innovative stories on this continent. I think we're such an entrepreneurial people. We are people who succeed in spite of our governments, not because of them. And this applies in just about every single African country, because those people stay wildin'. The people we elect, my God. But we move irregardless. As a people, we move. And that is, this African spirit, for me, is incredible. So I'll give you a good story, which the framing of it, or rather the foreground, is a tragedy. You remember on Sunday, the Precision Air crash in Bukoba, Lake Victoria. And I was out in Joburg, well, outside Joburg, and seeing this story, which is just heartbreaking, because I fly Precision Air all the time. It's a decent airline. And I think the expectation for many outlets is to say, oh, wow, an African airline crashed? Of course it's forgive the French, it's a shitty airline. No, it's not a shitty airline. It's got a great safety record. They haven't had any major accident in all that time. And I was willing for all these people to be saved, so actually I can cover another story of the miracle on the Hudson, because this pilot, obviously in bad weather, made the most of it and landed in the water, and people were saved. Unfortunately, what very likely happened, there's an investigation ongoing now, is that they did all land safely in water, but unfortunately many of them drowned because the rescue didn't happen on time. But the positive story out of this is the people that were saved were not saved by the government. They were not saved by emergency services from the airport. They were saved by local fishermen who saw this plane come into the water and rushed there. The door was opened by this 24-year-old fisherman who just essentially kicked it down and started pulling people out. He's got no training in search and rescue, but he's just a Tanzanian young man who saw something tragic happen and got on his boat and got there and saved it. That is an incredible, positive story. In the middle of such heartbreak and tragedy, you see the Tanzanian spirit rise. And that's why something I've been talking about on the air, because it's an incredible peek into who we are as a people.
Yeah.
Because the system failed. These people could all have gotten out of that aircraft, but they didn't, because nobody was there on time. And these are the stories that I hope that we can amplify more of across the continent.
Have we been conditioned?
I think Moky's dying to say something.
Have we been conditioned to just believe, all the negative things about us as a people? Is that something that is being, pushed by media, Moky?
Look, I don't know that we've been conditioned, but I think that when you're used to hearing a particular type of story and a particular narrative all the time, it becomes a reality. And I think it's the reason why we have so many of our young people leaving the continent. They don't believe that they don't believe in the African dream, but they believe in the American dream because they see it on television. They see it in the stories. But what I did want to say, actually, and Larry, to your point, I think to your credit, I love the way you covered that story. And I think one of the key things that, the Precision Air going down, one of the key things that you said that really struck me was that it was an airline with a good safety record. Because I think that the way typically people would assume that it's an African airline, that, it's bound to have gone down. But the important thing out of that is that we can cover difficult, challenging, negative stories in a different way, through a different lens. And I often use the example of NSARS in Nigeria that happened a couple of years ago. The way that story was initially covered was African Nigerians are killing their people. That they only spoke to the governor of Lagos State, the leaders. Nobody really went to the streets to actually find the young people. And I think that story could have been covered as a story of youth agency, young people taking agency to create the change they wanted to see. That is a positive story that comes out of a difficult situation. But the thing is, what we need more of is good stories. And I think to a certain extent, we're doing a disservice to alternative stories when we talk about cat stories. No, cat stories are fluff. That is puff. We're talking about, Bird put out stories recently about the new cryptocurrency exchange that opened in Botswana, for example. We did a story about this guy, I think in Nigeria, who's creating water out of thin air. There's interesting things happening on the continent. So let's not, relegate them to the cat story level. They're not. There's a space for those kind of stories. There's a space for these kind of stories, which show the resilience that Larry's talking about, the ingenuity, the innovation that is happening right on this continent. And my last thing is that African No Filter has just done another piece of research looking at creativity or innovation on the continent. And a big percentage of people we surveyed said they believe the next Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates will come out of this continent. They believe in the capabilities of this continent to innovate. And we need to be writing more about that because that is equally the reality.
Can I just add something? And you're right on it, because one of the things that we struggle with in the world of investigative journalism is, can investigative journalism tell a good story? Or is it about hunting the bad guys and exposing the rot? And is it only accountability journalism? And we're trying to see if we can have an alternative view to having a positive investigation. I can give you an example. Every year, the Ministry of Health releases maternal deaths and the hospitals that have actually had many maternal deaths or neonatal deaths and all that. Where my eye always goes is which hospital had many mothers who died. Maybe many children, and I want to investigate, was it carelessness, was it lack of theaters, was it what? Rather, isn't it also important that I look at the facility that had the least deaths and what could have contributed to it? What is that success story? How did this facility deep in Kamuli manage to only perhaps get the least maternal deaths in this report, and what lessons can we learn from it? So in my world of investigative journalism, one of the things I'm trying to contend with is, can investigative journalism be positive investigative journalism and not only exposing the rot and the terrible things that happen in society, but also investigating something good, and that something good can be shared with the world. Like, look, there's this small hospital in maybe Karamoja or Turkana that has actually used traditional medicine and supported, childbirth, and they have not registered any maternal deaths. And that goes back to what Moky was saying. Do we as a continent need to redefine news and redefine journalism away from what we have been taught in school?
So how do we do that without negating our responsibility to be a watchdog for the citizens on the continent? Again, like Moky mentioned, the big issues on the continent for us will be different to what it is for the Americans or the Europeans or everyone else. We've got serious issues with corruption and leadership and disease and all of that. And most of the time, stealing from the sick led to some action being taken because you're basically saying, we've got a problem here. How do we draw that balance? You're showing a bit of what happened in Nigeria when you went to cover the floods. Where do we maintain that pursuit of accountability as journalists, even as we try to change the narrative to say, look, we need to hold our leaders accountable. If we need to call them out when they are not doing their job. And yet when you do that sometimes, Solomon will tell you when he did that, he went through an experience where him and his wife and his children are being threatened.
I think the answer to that is something that Moky said before, that we have many problems here and we should cover those, but that should not be the only story. And that's, in my own experience, I tell my friends now that I think when I left NTV and went to the BBC, I think I sold out. Because I think there's such a critical role for local and national reporting to inform audiences, to hold powerful people accountable, to expose wrongdoing. And that is much more powerful than any other story I could do that reaches the international market, because our society functioning properly, our democracy in its best form requires investigative journalism. It requires experienced reporters staying at NTV and NBS and Daily Monitor and The New Vision, telling those stories. Because, you know, like I said before, our leaders stay wilding, y'all. Our leaders stay wilding. If we didn't have vigilant journalists keeping them accountable, they would move with such impunity that it would shock everyone. And this is not unique to Uganda or Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria. It's across the continent. That is why I need for strong local investigative reporting, to go to those local meetings, to attend those committees, to go to those local villages and say, this is not happening. There was money that was allocated for a road here that does not exist. Where did that money go? That's not a story that CNN or the BBC or Reuters will cover, but it's important to make sure that your taxpayers' funds are used adequately. And that's why the Monitor, the Nation, or whatever, the New Vision cannot lead with a positive story every day, because you have to expose that kind of shitty behavior.
So how are we going to do that when the best of you lot are abandoning the local media to go and work for international media houses?
No, but I don't agree with that. I think we've got some amazing journalists here. You know, Larry is one of a handful. They're not abandoning. There's a bunch of journalists here doing an excellent job. And I actually want to just talk a little bit about, you know, journalism movements that are happening to actually address this sort of over, you know, exposure of negativity. There are things like constructive journalism. What's the other one? Social solutions journalism that's happening, where journalists themselves are realizing putting out just negative stories, they're not achieving much, but they're now using these new, you know, ways of writing to just address the problem of holding power to accountability or shining a spotlight on wrongdoing by highlighting what is going right and where we can look to for solutions to fix some of our problems. So I think, you know, when we look at training of journalists as they're coming out of journalism school, it's sort of getting them up to speed with these new global trends in journalism. And, you know, it's happening. There is an organization called the Solutions Journalism Network that is working on this to actually capacitize newsrooms across Africa in this new way of journalism. So I think that's an important trend for local journalists to look at.
I agree, and that I don't think that we're abandoning the local media. I think there's obviously an aspiration for many African journalists to be able to, you know, take your career to the next level, and I completely respect that as somebody who picked that path. But I think the most important part of our job as reporters is being able to serve the audiences, our domestic audiences, because that's so powerful. And if all of us did leave, then we do a disservice to audiences here, people who read The Monitor, people who watch NTV, people who watch NBS, people who are on these places, because they deserve leaders that are held accountable. They deserve that wrongdoing exposed, and that's much more critical, I think, than any of the work those of us that no longer work in this space do. But there are people like Solomon who are out there doing it at a capacity with some level of independence that maybe they didn't have working for any one organization. There's a couple of people I admire across the continent, John Allen Namu in Kenya, Anas in Ghana. There's a couple of people who do this effectively. There's lots of journalism, digital or offline, digital journalism startups, video journalism startups that are doing this to a great degree, debunk media. I think they were here as well.
Yeah,
Those are great initiatives that we need to support, and I'm glad that Moky is funding some of this work to make sure that it spreads and goes as far as possible, because there's a real need for it.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing on what Moky and Larry are saying? I think that whilst we have, and I think Daniel Kalinaki wrote a very interesting piece on the exodus of senior journalists from newsroom and leaving it to young journalists from graduate school. And I think he titled it what? Let the last reporter switch off the newsroom lights. Yeah. Quite a very extensive story. I mean, after the exit of Kavuma from the Observer, the big names have since left. I think that it is important for us to look at how do we grow the next generation of journalists in the newsroom to continue pushing for the African story and the African agenda. And this is where I really want to appreciate the Media Challenge initiative. That in itself, I think that they're building the next generation of reporters who are going to shape the African narrative. I have had an opportunity to attend some of their sessions. Yeah. I think one of the modules that they're focusing on is the module of solutions journalism. Not only looking at accountability journalism, which is very important, but also solutions journalism. And that's the same thing that we're doing at the Institute, where we're trying to, train the next generation of, investigative journalists to do the story. And the fact that we're having this conversation of positive investigative reporting, perhaps it could be one of those things that we need to research about and incorporate into the curriculum of investigative journalism that we are pushing out at the Institute to support journalists out there to tell the African story in a different lens.
Yeah. So actually, Moky, I'd wanted for you to share some insights. You've been doing lots of studies, lots of research. In your parting shots later on, I would like you to tell us a little bit about the key lessons to pick up for us to be able to go and work with. But as we open up, there's, I'm sure, lots and lots of questions for you guys. And before we get to them, I wanted to just simply highlight our theme for this year, EASTFest this year. We're talking about local change, global impact, and how we can build informed and thriving communities through journalism. And we've just been talking about how the best of our journalists usually almost naturally end up sort of going up the chain and onto bigger things, Saka, Larry and Solomon and all of that. And yet, I get the feeling that you're still connected to local journalists on the ground and you're collaborating with them. If you don't mind just sort of telling us what you're doing about that, who you're working with and how you're doing that, so that it's obvious that we're doing some things actually to speak into having local change here on the continent that then feed into this global impact based on where you are and the positions, and then how that sort of circles back to take us in the direction that we want to go.
I think there's no foreign reporting without strong local reporting. A lot of the stories you read in any of those international outlets are often because a local reporter first wrote about them, and then we picked it up. And I often collaborated with local journalists as producers, as researchers and stuff. And we'll try and make sure they get the appropriate credit for it, because that's an entire different issue about the word fixers in foreign reporting and how they are people who are doing most of the work and get none of the credit. But I think in every single story I've done, in every single story I'm actually currently working on, there's one or two actual national reporters who are working with us, making sure that we're getting the facts right, making sure that we're getting the sources right, because these are their sources. This is their reporting that we're relying on. And that is why I say that expertise, that knowledge, that experience is so critical in building those informed audiences locally. Because often what does go out internationally is you're telling a story for an audience that has no knowledge of this. So you're trying to sometimes dumb it down as much as possible. And that's sometimes why I worry that oversimplification in stories that come out of this continent, because you're trying to get Americans to understand something really granular about a particular situation on the continent. Yeah. And again, I highly recommend, if you can, go and read my interview. I just tweeted about it, that talks a little bit about how I approach this kind of storytelling and why it's so important that local knowledge, that expertise remains. Some of it will disappear, but I think the bulk of it, and every time one person leaves, it creates an opportunity for somebody else. So I'm not worried about all of the best people leaving local and national outlets to try and find an opportunity abroad.
Yeah, right. Solomon, what do we do about recruiting African citizens into taking an active interest in the stories that are being told? You've been an investigative journalist for a very long time. You spend months and months working on this really, really big story, and then it comes out and people are not really paying that much attention to it sometimes, and it's sort of,
There's no impact, it's not trending?
Sometimes it happens, because we've seen some big stories there where stealing from the sick definitely caught on and led to some change, but you have worked on some big stories where you're thinking, this is going to shake some nests around here, and then the following day, life as normal for most people. What do we do to help people join in this sort of activism?
Yeah, so I think there's no use of cooking good food and no one eats it. It's that simple. You are in the kitchen putting all the spices, you brave the smoke that makes your eyes teary, and then when you put it on the dinner table or on the table, no one is there to consume it. I think that good journalism requires that the content that we do should be promoted so that the public can be able to see it. That it goes beyond just doing good stories. It comes into marketing and promoting those stories. One of the groups that has mastered that art is the BBC Africa Eye. They do it so well, right? They have a department that makes sure that Solomon looks at the project and tweets about it, so that people get to know about the next upcoming investigation that they're going to be outputting, so that people can consume that information and be moved by it to actually cause social change. Yeah. It is important that when you're doing an investigation, tell a few members of parliament to watch, tell people in places of power, tell Larry to put out a tweet for you, tell someone to actually add a voice so that that voice is amplified, so that people can consume that product and be able to relate with it and be inspired to move. Yeah. The disconnect, however, has been that, well, I'm just doing a good story, I'm going to put it out there, and you wait for impact and there's no impact. But also I think it's important to make those stories about people. I think it's John Allen who said that the closer you get to the people, the closer you get to the stories. We need to continue answering the question, why should the public care? When we fail to answer that question as reporters, then we're
Recording
just making noise.
stopped. Recording in progress.
Journalism can only be journalism when we answer that question. Why should the public care about the story I'm doing?
Yeah.
Why should the public be moved about the story I'm doing?
Right.
It is important for all of us as African journalists to put that. Why should a Karamojong chief seated in a Manyata in Kotido watching that story, care about that story? Until when we relate the stories to the people, that the reason why your wife died while giving birth is because someone stole the money which was meant to construct a hospital, only then will you get them to be up in arms. So I've seen really cool stories that are done that are not promoted. Everyone is busy doing whatever they're doing, and it just passes. It hurts so much, so bad, to put in energies in a story, and it just passes by.
And you've had a few of those, haven't you?
One of the stories that really, I think I should share.
Ooh, this is therapy. Okay.
Here we go. Yeah.
I did a story. Well, it didn't really was. I did a story that it was called "The Eyes Have It," and I was talking about how the Speaker of Parliament, top officials in Parliament, the Minister of Finance, then the Prime Minister, implicating them into a scandal that they were stealing 10 billion shillings from the COVID funds to actually give to MPs to go and do a lot of nothing. So I thought, my goodness, this story is just going to have the minister arrested. It's going to have Prime Minister put in there, Speaker. Well, we talked about it and we moved on. So, so there's always those stories that we really, give our best, and then they just silently pass by.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just...
No, I can imagine how painful that obviously must be. But that said, Moky, it's not all bad, is it? We've made some progress. Based on the studies that you've been doing and the research and all of that, if you don't mind sharing some insights, have we done some things right in terms of changing narratives? Because this is what you're at the heart of doing. Do you see us beginning to go in the right direction?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we've made a lot of progress. I mean, I think back to 1985, many of the people in this room were not born, but 1985 was a year of Live Aid. It was Bob Geldof. It was We Are the World. It was Michael Jackson. That was when the image of Africa and the industry of saving Africa started. We have come a long way since 1985. However, we still have a little bit of a way to go. But I think to just end up with where all our research, and we're not just a research organization, we also do grant making, we're trying to build community, and we do advocacy about just making people aware of the narrative their stories are feeding, because you'll be surprised how we as Africans are the first ones to put our hands up to say, we don't like the narrative. Look how people are looking at us, and look at the stories that they're writing about us. But we are, in many cases, the ones writing the story. So there are two things that we recommend. One is we need to find a way to reframe the negative stories that are equally important that we tell. So let's think about who is the hero of the story when you're talking about, end SARS, or you're talking about the floods. Is it the people who are coming to save us, or is it the people who are showing resilience? There are multiple ways to tell a story. And I really liked the lady at the beginning who said, Wangari Maathai, when she first came into the media space, she was this, crazy woman. And then when she got her Nobel Peace Prize, she was this incredible humanitarian. Same woman, just a different framing. And I think framing is so critical. And framing is why we need better trained journalists. It's a solution journalism. It's just being aware of the story you're writing. It's providing context. It's writing just full of stories that give the context to the story you're telling. The first thing is reframing stories. The second thing is, why don't we find new stories? There's so many untold stories out there of Africans who are doing amazing things. When we did our report, Narratives Around Doing Business in Africa, one of the things we found is that there were so few stories of African businesses told, because a lot of the focus was in global businesses. And Larry mentioned Twitter's office shutting down. When that Twitter office in Accra was opened, it was headline news. But there are over 500 tech companies in Ghana that were not being covered. So I'm just saying that we need to find our own stories, new stories, and tell them so that we can rebalance this image of Africa as the broken continent.
Well said, Moky. So we've got lots and lots of questions, of course, for you, not only here in the room, but online. I'm going to go through some of them and have you guys respond to them. So we had someone asking, this was for Solomon going back, so I think you touched on the issue of ECOP and what's happening with that. And they're saying that the environmental journalists are supposed to be watchdogs for society. Do two wrongs make a right, though? And they're saying that really evidence of the Industrial Revolution 50 plus years later, from droughts to heat waves, beg to differ. And apparently they're saying that Africa needs to be able to chart its own energy journey narrative, which enacts a paradigm shift in how we produce and consume. So that's something there to ponder on. Also, a point from Frida, who says that we need to redefine investigative journalism, like you mentioned, in terms of how we tell those stories. William is saying he's very happy with how you guys are thinking or what you're saying, because it's clearly the other side of the coin. And he says that imperialism and racism have often served as an ideological umbrella and the most essential source of our economic, cultural, and intellectual stuntedness. Some big words there. And he says, so how can African media then, much of it being an adjunct of the Western international monopoly system, ever expose imperialism without exposing itself?
That's for me?
You go ahead.
I feel like that's a Moky question. It's right up her alley. Listen, I think one of the reasons that we have some strong kind of regional media conglomerates. The Nation Media Group, my former employer, is one of them, that I think they need to do a lot more collaborative journalism as a whole. But one of the ways to reduce this dependence on AFP and Reuters and CNN and BBC is, I think, to just have more African reporters in more of these places feeding stories. I don't know, a network of, because even though you don't have foreign correspondents in every part of the continent. There's in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Botswana, in Senegal. There's locals telling those stories, and maybe there should be a way that these outlets can share their reporting, because then it's seen from the perspective and the view of the local, and that I think is a much more important way than trying to rely, okay, Reuters, the copy is clean, we can just put that on the page, the picture will be there. It's the easiest way, but maybe not the best way.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I can agree more with Larry. You see, the reason why we rely so much on international media is because we don't have enough funding. Reuters has literally correspondents all across Africa. The BBC has correspondents everywhere. You know, CNN is trying to expand its footprint on the continent. I think that how we can leverage on collaboration within media houses within Africa to share content,
right,
or perhaps get that one server where, you know, stories from Ghana can be put, stories from Uganda can be put, and that we can share those stories and be able to repurpose them for our different audiences in Africa. But of course, that will require us to organize ourselves, come up with, you know, an editorial team that is going to be also overseeing that.
It's a leadership thing, isn't it?
I think so, and I think it is more than ever. The need for collaboration cannot be overemphasized. Both doing usual journalism and investigative journalism. I'm happy with the different outfits that are coming off all across the continent. John Allan Namu with African Sense are doing an amazing job in Kenya. We're currently collaborating with him. Anas Anas in Ghana, Wits University in South Africa, and all these other different outlets. So when we collaborate together, right, we can do better.
Right.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to overemphasize what Larry was saying, the need for collaboration to push the African narrative.
I think the misunderstanding Africa has been a cottage industry for a long time. It's an entire African news industrial complex that is not meant to serve us. And we're here to disrupt that, one story at a time.
Yeah.
Having said that, I have to give a big shout out to, I think there is no other global outlet that does as much African storytelling of those positive, innovative, outstanding stories from the continent like we do on CNN International, with Inside Africa, with Marketplace Africa, with Africa Avant-Garde, with African Voices Change Makers. And these stories don't just air in Africa, they air around the world. So people get to see us as our artists, our inventors, our scientists, doing things not for the white gaze, but for us. That, I think, is powerful.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Moky?
Yeah, look, I think it has been said, and I completely agree with Solomon and Larry's idea about collaboration. And I think if there's actually an organization that's actually set up to actually do this, and to a certain extent, we have started the process, because BIRD has often been asked when we, you know, can you take our content, can you put our content out there? So maybe that's something that we could actually look at, because we're dealing with a lot of media houses who are actually quite keen to do this collaboration. But, you know, like I said, or like Larry says, it's one story at a time. That is how you change perceptions and you change the image. And I think we're making progress.
Let's take some questions from you here in the room, just a few of those. Edith has her hand up, I see. Oh, yeah.
She was just stretching.
No, she had her hand up. So naturally, since she already has a mic on her face, we'll start with her, and then we'll go around the room very quickly.
I have to say, it's very refreshing to see Moky back on the stage speaking about this. I had a similar conversation with her in Bonn, so it's really nice to see her back. The first point that I had was actually a comment on our YouTube session with Yasser from Tunisia. He did mention that on YouTube, what people respond to are two things: high arousal or low arousal. High arousal of emotions being high intensity things, joy, anger, frustration, outrage, excitement, inspiration. Should we then stop this binary thinking of good stories and bad stories, powerful stories and not powerful stories, and think rather about emotions and how people respond to them? My question now is to Larry. Hi, Larry.
Hey.
Do you think that the role we play, both you and I, as correspondents for Africa, one person covering an entire region, is tokenization of people of color, and therefore giving an excuse to global media to perpetuate this false narrative that they're covering Africa, when in fact they just have one person who's supposed to be an expert on 1 million people, 1 billion people?
That's deep, Larry.
Right,
You take a couple of them together?
I think, yeah, you might, you just, as you put your thoughts together, let's just, take a couple of, there's one at the back, and then we'll go round to the back and then come to the front.
Arnold Katongole is my name. My question goes to Larry and Solomon. That we as a continent, Africa, we celebrated these channels when they came into place. The BBC, Focus on Africa, Komula Duma, that's when he started it. We celebrated DW Africa, Al Jazeera Africa Investigates. These were channels that were supposed to take us to the next level. But our perception and the reality is actually differing, yeah? And I'm asking, if these channels only highlight the plight of Africa, we see this in our local news bulletin, be it at NBS, NTV, Monitor, New Vision. They do the same. So I expected these channels to come and get the innovation we have Africa, the good of Africa, to the next level of the world. But actually, when there is something good about Africa, they only bring it as a highlight. Yeah? But when there is something bad, it runs very deep. I watch BBC Focus on Africa, and whenever I see Peter Okocha reading news, or Sophie, Ikenyi, or Sarah, I look at these Africans in these studios in London. I think this would be pride that Africa has moved to the next level. But indeed, it's like mockery and satire they're doing. And I'm asking, what has caused this? Is this because we as Africa, the majority, we don't care about the angle these people take on us? Is it because there is a lacuna between the African editors in these newsrooms and the funders? Yes?
Right.
Or is it because the African journalists, because Solomon or Larry or I would want to move from NBS to BBC? I don't care about the perception of my continent because all they do is portray bad about Africa. As a Pan-Africanist and an African, of course, I know you are the watchdogs, you are the gatekeepers of checks and balance to the African leaders. But then, where is the good of Africa in all this?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And
thank you so much. It was such a very insightful conversation. Larry and Solomon, thank you so much. My name is Joseph. I represent a majority of the young people in this place that you inspire on a daily. My question will not be so much different from what he actually said, but my question goes to you, Larry, and this is a personal question. Where is, I actually wrote it down here so that I don't forget. Doesn't your quest to actually change the African narrative put you in danger, most especially pushing the agenda of your bosses, very well understanding that this is not what you represent, and this is not the end goal that you want to actually, because Solomon talked about the donor influence, and majority of the things that we do, if the donor is from the Western culture, we are going to push their agenda. Doesn't that affect on what we want to portray at the end of the day? Thank you so much.
thank you. I think to break that question into 4 words, are you a sellout? Right. Let's take the last one here, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Thank you very much. My name is Dennis. I'm a copywriter. I think the African image and stories are being traded for funding. For instance, I ran a small organization with my friend, a leadership and entrepreneurship organization. So one time we were recommended to work with some guys called Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity. We wrote a concept to them, and guess what? They started twisting the concept to their interest. Again, so the African image, the African stories are being traded for actually funding. A lot of people want to sustain the organizations, so that's why they are trading. So I don't think Larry has a lot of questions, but I think I'll direct this to Mr. Simon. Mr. Solomon, do you relate to something like this?
Right. So if I can ask you a question, did you get funding from that organization?
No, we are still struggling. We're still saying, no, this is not what we want.
Okay.
Because it is what they want and it's not what we want.
Right, just wanted to check. Yeah. Cool.
Wow. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to need to sit down here. Edith. The tokenization of Africans. Yes, it's problematic when we're a continent of 1 billion people and we have one token African covering the entire continent. I think nobody would disagree with that. Like I said, the BBC had 13 correspondents covering North America. So there was no shortage of news about North America because there are a lot of people doing that. Why don't we have the same level of resources dedicated to covering a continent like us? Because there's a lot of stories from here, good and bad, right? There's conflicts, there's the impact of climate change, there's beauty, there's music, there's art, there's a life here. And we definitely need more people talking about us. Part of the problem is that so much of the coverage of Africa is designed for the white gaze. It's not made for us by us. And that is why that collaboration among African media outlets is important, so that we're not creating content for the white gaze, we're creating it for other Africans. We're creating it to see ourselves reflected back at us in our music, in our art, in our struggles, in our triumphs, in all of that. I think that's the most powerful way that we help ourselves understand ourselves. Because we're such a rich, diverse, beautiful continent with people who speak 2,000 languages, who have different cultures. And so much of the way we see ourselves is through the medium of the Western press. It's not directly among ourselves. That's an economic problem, that's a historical problem, that's a little thing called colonization that gave us that gift. But like I said, misunderstanding Africa has been such a cottage industry for decades, centuries. The reason the colonizers got here is because some people came here and wrote nice letters that they'd read in little bars and cafes, and they're like, oh my God, we need to go and find out this place and discover it. We're gonna call this lake after our queen. Wouldn't that be nice? And they did, and we hang on to those names to date. So this is a historical problem that we have to deal with. So Focus on Africa TV from the BBC is moving to Nairobi. So maybe those nice anchors won't be sitting in London for a change. They will be sitting in Nairobi. And I don't know how that changes the kind of stories they will be telling, the kind of guests they will have on, the perspectives they will tell. It remains to be seen. That's going to happen sometime in the new year as part of the BBC's cost cutting. They're moving those programs to Nairobi. So actual Africans sitting in Africa, telling African stories will happen. I hope it won't be for the white gaze. It will be for other Africans, because that program is also syndicated across African broadcasters, including here in Uganda. So that's one thing that's happening. I think for me, because the stories of tragedy often are the ones that get the most play, who is the hero of this story? Like Moky asked. I think about that all the time. How am I telling this in a way that's stereotypical, that plays into lazy, racist tropes? Or am I making sure that my perspective as an African born and raised here is informing how I tell this story? So it's a global story. Twitter's shut down. Twitter's fired half this workforce, and they're all getting severance pay. They're being told this is the next steps. We'll pay you until February. But the Africans, they don't get that. The actual letter just said, we wish you the best in your endeavors. The letter to the Americans and the Europeans said, here's what the next steps are. We will pay you until this date. And if you have any other questions, here's a little fact sheet. The Africans didn't get that. That is also a story that needs to be told, and I'm glad it got picked up, and like I said, the BBC matched it. That's my approach to telling these sorts of stories, to make sure that our agency comes across in these stories, that our perspective is represented. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not used of answering the hard questions. I'm used of asking
the hard questions. He has a literal show called that.
This time I'm the one who is supposed to be answering the hard questions. But I think, let me start from where Larry stopped. I think the fact that we have the BBC's second biggest bureau in Nairobi is quite big, right? Manned by Africans, right? You know, of course, there are a few. I don't know if I should use the word.
Lean into it, say it.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, okay, so having the BBC's second biggest bureau in Africa is quite big, and the news that Focus on Africa, is moving to Africa so that they can focus on Africa, done by African journalists and African editors, which is really cool. And for me, that's a plus. So the other thing is that I have worked at the BBC and on the Focus on Africa desk. I think that the African story is being told. I want to differ from what one of you said. I think having people like Bola on Focus on Africa Radio, the team, what's the lady who was leading Focus on Africa?
Vera?
Yeah,
Coffee?
Vera, and then there's the one who was doing the radio. She now moved to the Africa Eye Desk. Amazing people there, trying to tell the African stories. I think we on Focus on Africa, we've seen so many positive stories about the continent, stories of development, stories of, young entrepreneurs, people who have invested in tech, and that is good. So I don't want to completely say that the people who are running the Focus on Africa desk have sold their souls. I don't think so. I think we have really good journalists on the Focus on Africa desk doing amazing, stories, and editors controlling the narrative about Africa from London, telling the positive stories about Africa. I think, Larry, you've been on that desk before, and also we're telling,
I think, that's true. They are all African journalists who are just as invested as we are in making sure that they tell an accurate story of the continent. So I don't think they see themselves as people who are there to kind of misunderstand or misrepresent us. I know these people, I've worked with them, they're good, fine journalists, so at least I can speak to. Sometimes, listen, this is complicated, one show differs from the other, there's lots of complex dynamics, but on balance, I think they do a good job of covering us.
Yeah. And the fact that we have a whole Focus on Africa, there's 20, 30 minutes on international news. I was in Belgium and, the Focus on Africa program was there. And I'm like, even these white people are also watching Focus on Africa, which is really cool. I also wanted to say that, programs like, on CNN, African Voices, you see that international media. DW is also focusing on Africa. There's an appetite for African stories, but different stories, even on the international scene, by the way. I think for me, that also should be given a positive, a pat on their back. The fact that the global media is interestingly getting, we're getting the attention to share our positive stories. CGTN, whatever views you have with them, I know we have mixed reactions and views about CGTN, but we're also seeing the positive African stories coming through CGTN, and having a bureau in Nairobi, and manned by African journalists is also something positive, for example. So I don't want to say that all is gone and all is to cry about, but I think the bottom line is African journalists should be able to tell the African story and leverage on collaboration. And you, sir, you talked about, I'm glad to hear that you're a Pan-Africanist. We haven't sold our souls. We try to use our spaces to tell the African story. And you are saying, isn't it because of the funding we are getting? Larry, for example, whispered in my ears and told me there are so many stories I've refused to do, because I don't think that portrays Africa. There's funding that I have refused to take on because there are stories that I don't think I'm willing to do, not for anything, right? While there's funding from the West to come and tell some of those stories from a different lens, there are some of us who have said no. We will not do some things because that's not what we believe in. And it goes back, for me, in a nutshell, redefining news and journalism for Africa.
How we tell those stories.
And how we
Thank you very much, Solomon. Let's have a last word from you, Moky, as we wrap up the session.
She's gone.
Oh, we've already lost her. She had to drop off. Right. We have overshot our time. I'm sorry. Too engaging. So thank you so much for being a wonderful part of this discussion. Of course, it continues online again. Our hashtag EASTFest2022, the key takeaways for you, things that have stood out from what Moky and Larry and Solomon have shared. Please go share those like you had. The most important thing is to amplify the good things that we're hearing about in terms of what they have shared. So please go amplify these stories and let's tell the African story the right way. So thank you very much, and a big thank you to our panel, to Larry and Solomon, for doing justice to this very difficult and sensitive topic. And thank you. I'll hand back to Edith as we go on to our next session now.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. You may have your seats. But Larry did not answer the question as to whether or not he's a sellout.
She really just tries to put me on the spot. Am I a sellout? The air miles are nice, though. No, that's not the question. Of course, I'm not a sellout. And I think that the point that I make, and you think about this all the time with every story you do, that there is no reason that you would sell your own people out. And therefore, there's no reason that we'd go out there to deliberately paint any lazy, racist stereotypes about ourselves. So I think about this constantly, and I want to make sure that the stories I'm telling center the right heroes and tell the right narratives and push back on some of that bad, lazy, oversimplified narratives we had so much about.
Yep. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Larry Madowo, Solomon Serwanja, and Moky Makura.